Hey, good evening, everyone. It's so good to be with you here tonight. This is my first time at Praxis, so thank you, Pastor Phil, for the invite, getting to be here with you, and to get to help you finish out this series on the Gospel of Mark. You know, when he invited me, I said, yes, I'd love to talk about Mark. It's such an awesome gospel. It's short, to the point, very direct. It's all about discipleship and following Jesus. But he also asked me to talk about my favorite disciple of Jesus as well. And of course, I'm not talking about Peter, James, or John, or any of those other disciples we might think about. I'm actually talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, in case you aren't familiar with who I'm talking about, he's my favorite theologian, and I don't get to talk about him very much. So Pastor Phil said I could nerd out a little bit tonight. So if you'd be patient with me. I don't get to talk to him when I teach my courses here at Loma Linda very often, so I get to do that a little bit tonight. But he is one of my favorite theologians. And who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Well, he was, to start out, he was a German pastor, theologian, of course, who lived during the rise of National Socialism, rise of Nazism in Germany during the 1930s. He was an incredible thinker, writer, wrote some of the great spiritual classics that we have today. He was a part of a group called the Confessing Church that resisted the rise of the idolatry of Christian nationalism in Germany at the time. He trained a small community of pastors, a part of an illegal seminary, an underground seminary. He became a part of the resistance against Hitler. He was eventually arrested, and sadly, just before the end of the war, he was executed and lost his life. And for me, Bonhoeffer is an example of costly discipleship and faithful obedience to Jesus Christ. Now, if you ever go to London and you visit the very famous Westminster Abbey, and you come in the entrance, it's called the Great West Door. You might see there on that west door, there's 10 sculptures across the entrance to that door. And they commemorate 20th century martyrs. There's 10 of them. And on that list of martyrs there, that sculptures, there's Menche Masamalo, a young South African girl who was killed by her parents in 1928 for her desire to convert to Christianity. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is there. Of course, we know Dr. King and his efforts to end racial segregation and discrimination through nonviolence resistance here in our country. Oscar Romero is on the list, the Archbishop of San Salvador, El Salvador, who was assassinated in 1980 while performing Mass due to his outspoken condemnation of human rights violations and abuses during his country at the time. And Wang Zhiming, a Chinese pastor who was executed during the Cultural Revolution in 1973 for his leadership in his Christian community in China. They're all on the list and more. But on that list as well is Dietrich Bonhoeffer holding his Bible. And we could certainly discuss among these people whether or not they are really Christian martyrs, and it's been debated. But my point in all of this and sharing this with you is that Bonhoeffer is often seen as a heroic figure, larger than life, and his story in many ways now at this point has become almost hagiography, we call it, more than even biography. In fact, some of you may be aware that we're kind of having a Bonhoeffer moment right now because this past fall, Angel Studios produced a movie about his life. It was just in the theaters recently. Maybe some of you saw it. I saw it a few times, and there's plenty of things I enjoyed about the film, but there's a lot of things I didn't enjoy about the films, things that they didn't get very right. It's hard to tell the story of someone's life in a couple-hour film, right? And I'm not going to get into all that tonight. It's not my point. So you may be asked, so what does this all have to do with the Gospel of Mark? What's it have to do with that? Well, as I said, following Jesus, right, it's a major theme. Discipleship is a major theme in the Gospel of Mark, and you've probably noticed that the last several weeks. It's there from the beginning to end. Discipleship, it's the start of Mark, it's in the middle of Mark, and it's at the very end of Mark. And perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in the Gospel of Mark comes right around chapter 8. And there's a whole bunch of incredible, amazing things that happen there. So one of those things is Jesus feeds like thousands and thousands of people with just a few loaves of bread and fish, right? You remember that. And the disciples are amazed. Peter's amazed. In fact, Peter is so stunned by what he sees that it leads him to say, this is the Messiah, the Son of God, right? And what happens in that incredible moment of recognition? Well, Jesus basically says to him, guess where this is all going to head? Well, let's just read it, what he says. He calls everyone together, and he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man but to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? And the rest of Mark, the entire way, is a journey, a downward journey to suffering and death and a cross. That's where it goes. And now we've come to the end of Mark, the last chapter, and we've come to resurrection, right? The ending, the glory of the resurrection. Jesus is alive and he's risen. But there's something you may not have noticed about Mark. It's different than the other two Gospels, Matthew and Luke. It ends very differently. Mark ends with an asterisk. It ends with an asterisk. It has two different endings. Now, I can't get into all the technicalities of this, but all of the oldest manuscripts that we have for the Gospel of Mark end at chapter 8. They end just simply like this. The women come to the tomb in the morning. They discover that Jesus' body is gone. An angel tells them that he is risen and he's gone off. And here's how it ends, just like this. And they went out and fled from the tomb, and trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's it. End of story. Now, there's all kinds of theories of why it ends that way. But that's how the oldest manuscripts end. But there's an asterisk. And then you have verses 9 to 20. And you get, like the other two Gospels, you have Jesus' appearances, you have the commissioning of the disciples, you have Jesus showing up and having conversations with them, and you have the ascension, you have the glory, you have all the amazing things that happen after the resurrection. Now, one of the theories of a New Testament scholar, several actually, is intriguing. And these are scholars that hold to that shorter ending, the older manuscripts, because they follow that downward trajectory from the middle of Mark to the cross. And they suggest that, yes, Jesus is alive, the tomb is empty, he is risen, but it's as Mark is saying to us now, it's up to you. It's up to you. It's up to the church. What is it going to look like now for you to go into the world and to follow Jesus? What is it going to look like for you today? And for me, in many ways, seeking to answer that question is the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, maybe I should tell you a little bit more about his story. to explain what I mean. So, if there's one thing you need to know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer to get started, it's that he came from a very large family, a very close family. He had 8 brothers and sisters. Bonhoeffer was born in a place called Breslau, Germany. Now, today it's Poland, part of Poland. 1906, he was born with a twin. He had a twin sister, Sabine. His family was very close, highly educated family. His father was a psychiatrist, a famous psychiatrist in the University of Berlin. His mother, Paula, was kind of the spiritual leader in the home. They weren't a very religious family. You could say they're religious. They weren't religious, but they were spiritual. But they took their faith seriously. They were the kind of family that went to church on those special occasions. But Bonhoeffer, at a very young age, decided that he was going to be a pastor. And even his older brothers kind of made fun of him at first. But he stayed true to his sense of calling, that that's what he wanted to do. But then in 1918, his older brother Walter was killed in the Great War, World War I. And it deeply affected his family, his mother and his father, and even Bonhoeffer. And it forced him to wrestle with suffering and death and with faith, this question of what faith really meant. And it would shape him for the rest of his life. Now, several years later, as his education went on, Bonhoeffer would go on to write his first doctoral dissertation. Guess when it was? Guess how old he was? 21 years old. And he would go on to write a second one by the age of 24. Can you imagine that? 2 doctoral dissertations by the age of 24. He was brilliant. And within a year of doing that, he went off to the United States, to New York City, to Union Theological Seminary to accept a Sloan Kettering Fellowship to study theology in America for a year with the great Reinhold Niebuhr, one of America's great theologians. But little did he know that that year in the United States, just that 1 year would transform his life forever. See, he came to America as this very upper-class German, arrogant, part of these great German universities, theological education. He came knowing it all, and he thought American theology was kind of like lowbrow. Even Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Reinhold Niebuhr, was like, well, who is this guy? But he met 2 people, 2 classmates, while he was there. The first was a young man by the name of Frank Fisher, a black classmate. And Frank Fisher took him to the Abyssinian Baptist Church, where he discovered African American worship in Harlem. He discovered gospel music. In fact, he loved it so much that he went to church there every Sunday. He began to teach Sunday school while he was there. And when he went back to Germany, he took gospel music back to his family and friends. And they're like, what is this music? Right? When he went back. But when he was there, he discovered the plight of African Americans. He discovered what segregated America was like. He began to see the world from below. He began to see a whole different way of how people lived. And he took that back with him to Germany. And it helped him see what was going on in Germany in a whole different way. Another friendship that he formed when he was in New York was a Frenchman. Now, imagine this, World War I, right? Germany, France, mortal enemies. And here you have a Frenchman and a German going to school together, and they become dear friends. This Frenchman was named Jean Lassalle, and John was a pacifist. And he introduced Bonhoeffer to a whole new way of reading the Sermon on the Mount. Rather than seeing the Sermon on the Mount as like these just ideals that were impossible to ever live by, that's how a lot of Christians read them. Lassalle said, no, Jesus was serious. He wanted us to live these out and take them seriously. So when Jesus said to love your enemies, He meant them. And it blew Bonhoeffer's mind. And he took this all back with him to Germany when he returned a year later. And when he returned to Germany, he returned to a Germany where National Socialism was on the rise, Nazism was on the rise, and Hitler was coming to power. And with this inspiring him, he got involved in something called the Confessing Church. It was a group of Christians that were resisting Christian nationalism. The church was being taken over by National Socialism, and these small group of Christians began to resist. He became a part of that. In fact, they eventually asked him to run an illegal seminary, underground seminary for Christian pastors who were part of the resistance. It was way off in the middle of nowhere in Germany. And he started this community of pastors. And many people thought, even some of his closest friends thought, what are you doing? You're just running away. You're escaping to get away from all this. But what they didn't realize is this group of pastors that he was training for the resistance was not to escape the world, but it was to resist, to enter the world and to resist. And it was during this time that Bonhoeffer wrote two great spiritual classics that still inspire Christians today. The first was Life Together, where he wrote about what it looked like to live in spiritual community together. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to check it out. And the second book, probably one of Bonhoeffer's most famous books, people know it as The Cost of Discipleship. It was simply called in German, Nachfolge, or to follow, or simply discipleship, where he talked about this thing called costly grace. And one of his most famous paragraphs in the book, I'll just read it to you, where he says this. He describes costly grace as this versus cheap grace. He said, costly grace is the hidden treasure in a field for the sake of which people go and sell with joy everything they have. It is this costly pearl for whose price the merchant sells all that he has. It is the call of Jesus Christ which causes a disciple to leave his nets and follow him. It is costly because it calls to discipleship. It is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs people their lives. It is grace because it thereby makes them live. And above all, grace is costly because it's costly to God, because it costs God the life of God's Son, and because nothing can be cheap to us, which is costly to God. Isn't that beautiful? And so as Nazi oppression intensified, Bonhoeffer moved beyond theological resistance to direct involvement in the German resistance movement. And though he had become a committed pacifist, in fact, he'd been accused of being a pacifist, so much so that he'd been banned from traveling, he'd been banned from teaching at any university, he was banned from preaching in any church. He was almost basically under house arrest at his parents' home in Berlin. And so the only way to avoid being conscripted and forced to fight in the war in the military was to, thanks to some connections he had, one of them his brother-in-law, was to join something called the Abwehr, or the German Military Intelligence Agency. And while he was there, he took on the role of a double agent with the resistance. It was an interesting role to be in, because he had to pretend he was a Nazi, right? While he was a part of the resistance. So he's a part of this secret military police, pretending to be a Nazi, but he's also a spy for the resistance. And his main role was basically to get secret messages out of Germany to England, to the Archbishop of the church in England, to get messages to the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to basically say, there are people in Germany, there is resistance. We're not all bad. Those are some of the tasks that he was assigned as part of the resistance. But eventually, as time went on, the plot thickened, and there was a decision by some of the people he was connected with that the only choice left was to assassinate Hitler. And It was around this time that Bonhoeffer had to seriously wrestle with his position of pacifism and something he began to wrestle with in his ethics called responsible action. And to this day, people struggle to make sense of Bonhoeffer's life and his decisions at this time, to be part of the resistance to assassinate Hitler. Now, if you see the movie, they make it look like he had a direct, part of making the bomb to assassinate Hitler. Couldn't be anything farther from the truth. But he was connected with it. He was almost the chaplain, if you will, the pastor to the people who were planning all that, helping them wrestle with making the ethical decisions. But in April of 1943, Bonhoeffer was arrested by the Gestapo. Part of the reason he was arrested was because he was accused of helping a group of 7 Jewish people escape to Switzerland. The real truth was that he was connected, but he was part of kind of like a money laundering, helping them get money to be able to escape and get out. But that was the suspicion. That's why he was arrested. And he was imprisoned in Tegel prison, a prison in the heart of Berlin. It was full of political prisoners at the time. And it was here that he was able to see some family members would come see him. His fiancée, Maria, was able to come visit him, and his friends. And they were able to get him papers and writing, pencils and pens, and he was able to start writing. And he was able to smuggle these out of prison. And today we have these manuscripts. We call them letters and papers for prison. And they're incredible things that we have, letters and things that he wrote, ideas that he was writing. And he began to explore this concept called religionist Christianity, questioning how faith could remain relevant in a secular world. Years later, some questioned that maybe he'd abandoned Christianity, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Rather, Bonhoeffer was calling for a faith that stripped of cultural trappings, a faith that engaged fully with the world rather than retreating from it. And then just weeks before the end of the war, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was transferred to Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria on the border of the Czech Republic. You can see a picture I actually took here on the lower part of the screen when I visited there a few years ago. He was transferred there, where he was executed by hanging on the morning of April 9, 1945, just a couple weeks before Germany's surrender to the Allies. A year later, in a letter from prison to his friend Eberhard Bethge, who would go on to write his biography, we wouldn't have anything from Bonhoeffer today without his friend Eberhard. Bonhoeffer reflected, and he wrote this in this letter. He said, "What keeps gnawing at me is this question. What is Christianity? Or who is Christ actually for us today?" Who is Christ for us today? In other words, what does it look like for us to follow Christ today? Now imagine the context of him asking that question. Bonhoeffer would never stop asking that question. What does it mean to follow Christ? Not just in another time, in another place, but here, now. What does discipleship actually require? What does costly grace look like in real life? For Bonhoeffer, the answer was never abstract. It wasn't never theory. It had to take shape in concrete, real-world decisions, in real obedience to Jesus. Almost 10 years before that fateful day in Flossenburg, Bonhoeffer wrote these words in that same book we just thought about, Discipleship. And he said this, and I quote, "It is laid on every Christian, the first Christ suffering that everyone has to experience is the call which summons us away from our attachments to this world. It is the death of the old self in the encounter with Jesus Christ. Those who enter into discipleship enter into Jesus' death. They turn their living into dying. Such has been the case from the very beginning. The cross is not the terrible end of a pious, happy life. Instead, it stands at the beginning of community with Jesus Christ. Christ calls us. His call leads us to death. In the summer of 1939, Bonhoeffer's family and friends did everything they could to get him out of Germany. War was coming, and they knew that his outspoken opposition to Hitler had put him in danger. Through connections, Bonhoeffer secured passage back to the United States again, where he had been invited to return to Union Theological Seminary. This time, his friend, former professor Reinhold Niebuhr, had secured a faculty teaching position for him there. It was safe. He had a way out. But something unsettled him when he arrived in the United States. He'd only been in America for a few weeks when he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. From across the ocean, he could see what was happening in his homeland. And he knew he could not remain in the safety when his fellow brothers and sisters back home, his countrymen, suffered under the Nazi regime. And so in a letter, again, to Reinhold Niebuhr, he wrote this, and he said, I quote, "I have made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period of our nation's history and with the people of Germany." And so just a few weeks after arriving here, Bonhoeffer booked passage on the last civilian ship bound for Germany before World War II broke out. His decision to return in 1939 wasn't just an act of courage. It was an act of something called, and this is the German word, and I'm going to slaughter it, Stellvertretung. And basically meant this: vicarious representative action. What does that mean? Well, it was a key theological concept throughout his writing. And it simply meant this when we look at his life. He could have remained in America, safe from the war and the coming persecution, but he understood this, that discipleship is not about self-preservation. It's not about standing, it's not about looking out for yourself, making sure that you're safe. It's not about you at all. Stellvertretung, vicarious representative action, is about standing in solidarity with others, bearing their burdens, and being present where God has placed us in our time and place. He could not speak of costly grace from a distance. He couldn't shepherd a persecuted church while living in safety. So he had to turn back, knowing the cost. But this idea, this word, Stellvertretung, it didn't begin with Bonhoeffer. It didn't come from Bonhoeffer. It's a word rooted in Jesus Christ himself, the one who bore the sins of the world. And Bonhoeffer saw that Christ's entire life was one of vicarious representative action, of standing in the place of others. Jesus didn't suffer for himself, but for us. He was the sinless one who bore the burden of sin, the righteous one who suffered for you and for me, for the unrighteous, the innocent one who took upon himself the guilt of all of us, of humanity. As Bonhoeffer wrote, again in Discipleship, to be sure, Christ's own suffering is the only suffering that brings reconciliation, because Christ has suffered for the sin of the world, because the whole burden of guilt fell on him, and because Jesus Christ passes on the fruit of his suffering to those who follow him, temptation and sin fall also onto his disciples. For Bonhoeffer, to follow Christ meant participating in his standing in place of the other. Not in a way that redeems, only Christ can do that, but in a way that reflects his suffering and love in the world. The disciple doesn't take Christ's place, but the disciple is called to bear the burdens of others, just as Christ bore ours. On April 8, 1945, the day before his execution, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was asked by his fellow prisoners to lead a worship service. At first, he hesitated. Many of them were Catholic. He was Lutheran. Some of them were atheists. But even one of the non-religious prisoners urged him to lead out. And so he agreed. And so he read from Scripture, choosing two passages that carried deep significance. The first from Isaiah 53. With his stripes, we are healed. And then from 1 Peter 1:3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy, we have been born anew, a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And then Bonhoeffer prayed with them, spoke on the scriptures, and reminded them of the hope of the resurrection. But before the service could even conclude, two men in civilian clothes appeared. Prisoner Bonhoeffer, get ready and come with us. He knew what that meant, so he quickly packed his few belongings, leaving behind a book that he was reading, with his name written it 3 times, as if to leave evidence that he had been there. And as he prepared to leave, he turned to one of his fellow prisoners named Payne Best, and he whispered his final words. This is the end. For me, the beginning of life. This is discipleship, my friends. This is discipleship. This is what it looks like to follow Jesus all the way to the end, trusting that beyond the cross, there's life. And this brings us back to where we began, with Jesus' call in Mark 8. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And to the ending of Mark's gospel, the short ending where the women flee the tomb in fear, it leaves us hanging, it leaves us unsettled. It leaves us with the question, what will we do? Who is Jesus Christ for us today? Jesus is risen. The story is unfinished, and the call to follow him is still before us always. Discipleship doesn't wait for a neat, resolved ending. It doesn't always lead where we expect, but Bonhoeffer's life and his death remind us that the way of the cross is the way to life. And the only question remains is, where is Christ calling us today? And will we choose to follow? Amen.